Margherita CAPPOCK, che invito. Curatrice della Dublin City Gallery e responsabile appunto dell'importantissimo lavoro fatto di ricostruzione e di catalogazione, un lavoro esemplare di catalogazione fatto sui materiali dello studio di Francis Bacon. Lascio la parola. Lascio la parola a Margherita.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak here this evening. It's a great privilege to be here in Pisa. I'm going to talk about Francis Bacon's studio, which was transplanted from London to Dublin, where it is open to the public. The studio was presented to our gallery, which is this gallery here, Dublin City Gallery, the Hugh Lane, in 1998. And we received the gift of the entire contents of Francis Bacon's studio, which you see here at 7 Rees Mews, South Kensington in London. And this rather unusual gift consisted of 7,500 items in this room, and it marked the beginning of a unique project for the gallery. I joined the gallery as project manager for Francis Bacon's studio, and I'm still working on the archive. I'm not a conservator, I'm an art historian and a curator. And in this paper, I want to provide an outline of the studio and its contents, and also explain the approach that we took to removing the studio from its home in London and transporting it from its original site to its present location in Dublin, and how we interpreted the studio contents and how we have it presented now in a gallery context. And I will also show, given the audience here today, which is mainly conservators, I will show a sample of Francis Bacon's artist materials and some of the unfinished artworks that were found in the studio in order to ascertain what the studio tells us about Francis Bacon's practice. Now, I want to show you the exterior of the studio. This is the studio in London. It's on a quiet cobblestone lane in South Kensington, which is quite an exclusive part of London. And Francis Bacon moved into number 7 Rees Mews in 1961. And this was his principal studio and residence until his death in 1992. It was one of a short row of converted coach houses off a main street, and the Mews was quite a modest dwelling, particularly when Bacon became very, very successful later on in his career. The ground floor, which you see here, was entirely occupied by a garage, which Bacon used for storage. And then the upper floor was reached by this very steep staircase, which we have reconstructed in the gallery, and people can walk over it. There's glass on top of it, so you have the sense of entering the studio. This was his bed sitting room, and you'll note that it's very neat and tidy compared with the studio. You also notice the bare light bulbs that hang down, and this is a motif that he uses in his paintings. He had a very unusual arrangement of a kitchen cum bathroom, and you can see the bath here. He had this bath put in at some stage in the 1970s, and when he was taking a bath and it got cold, he turned on the gas oven and opened the door to heat the room. So quite an eccentric arrangement. And here you see, this is over his sink. He has reproductions of his own paintings so that there was no escaping from his art. So the studio was very much part of a living space. So you'd come up the stairs and turn right into the artist's studio. And this is what you would see. The door of the studio was completely covered. He used it quite extensively as a pallet. And in contrast to the very Spartan quality of the bedroom and the kitchen cum bathroom, the studio was quite chaotic. And Bacon said about this chaos, he said, "I feel at home here in this chaos because chaos suggests images to me." And the room was actually quite small. It was 24 feet long by 12 feet wide. Originally, it was 2 rooms, but the dividing wall was removed at some stage in the distant past. The light, the main source of light, was from a skylight which Bacon had put in the 1970s, and the orientation of the room was east-west, which meant that it was brightly lit during the early hours of the day. The studio really became Bacon's complete visual world. Bacon was an artist who preferred not to work from life, so very few people had access to his studio during his lifetime. He eliminated the live model early on. He found it too inhibiting to have a person modeling or present in his studio. So everything that you see strewn around the floor, the photographs, the books, these were all his inspiration for his paintings. And these provided nearly all of his visual sources. We can see the extensive range of artist materials. I don't think he ever cleaned a paintbrush because there were several hundred all in these jars. And this table here just consists entirely of artist materials. Also, here we have another table which actually took 3 months to deconstruct, catalogue and reconstruct. And you notice various things, just to point out, you have pieces of corduroy trousers with paint on top of them, which he used to print onto his paintings, aerosol sprays and paint rollers, household paint rollers for painting the background of his paintings. Right, is that, yeah, okay. So you have a vast array of artist materials found in this studio. This is one end of the studio with a shelf, and you can see that you've used jars of pigment and paint. You've paint brushes. You also have quite a lot of dust in the studio, and Bacon would actually use the dust. He would run his finger along the shelf, for example, this shelf, and then he would incorporate the dust into the wet paint and apply it onto the canvases. So there's a huge diversity of material, and Bacon's technique was quite diverse too. So it was in this cluttered and paint-spattered room that Bacon realised some of his most important paintings, including his large-scale triptychs. And it is from this small room that Bacon's stature grew into that of the preeminent figurative painter of the late 20th century. And the studio was very important to Bacon. He said that he couldn't work anywhere else. He did have a studio for a time in Paris, but he preferred the light in his Rhys Mews studio. Now, on Bacon's death in 1992, John Edwards was the sole inheritor the sole beneficiary of Francis Bacon's will. And part of this inheritance included the studio. And Edwards decided, following extensive negotiations with various galleries, that he would present the studio to Dublin City Gallery, because Dublin is where Bacon was born in 1909. And the gift was made with the proviso that we would reconstruct the studio and open it to the public and have it on permanent display, which is what we have. So the Hugh Lane Gallery embarked on a very complex project which involved deconstructing the studio and relocating it from its first floor in Rhys Mews to a dedicated Francis Bacon space at the Hugh Lane. Now, due to the nature of this project, it was very, very challenging in terms of presentation and interpretation. A gallery is obviously a space where people expect to see finished works of art, whereas by deciding to have an artist's studio on display as a permanent exhibit, the emphasis was being placed on process rather than the end product. So this, and we are a relatively small gallery, relatively speaking, and so it was a very big project for us. And obviously, from an academic point of view, cataloguing 7,500 items and what it could reveal about Francis Bacon's techniques, again, and what it could contribute to current scholarship on the artist, was really a journey into new territory for us. Now, the task of deconstructing the entire room and transporting it to Dublin was a daunting one. And after quite a lot of deliberation, we decided that a team of archaeologists would be best equipped to actually remove the studio from its home and reconstruct it. And this image here shows two of the archaeologists working. Obviously, it was important that the studio contents be removed with meticulous care, and obviously and also to ensure that the accuracy of the reconstruction was absolutely perfect. And the principle, obviously, of archaeological excavation is to remove all the superimposed features one by one in the reverse order from which they were accumulated. And this was the approach that we took. So you can see here that the archaeologists set up, they devised a grid system, horizontal and vertical grid system, and photographs were taken as they went along, as they deconstructed. And just in brief, what they did was they ascribed a feature. These are some of the original notebooks that they made. So every single item in the studio had a code, and the code told us where it was found, what was beside it, what was underneath it. So first of all, obviously, the larger items of furniture were removed. These are some of the original drawings that the archaeologists made on the spot, showing detailed drawings of the various layers as they moved down. And again, here you see that they have wrapped up that large table with all the artist materials, and they're gradually taking everything out of the room. This is a large mirror that Bacon designed himself, and it's being wrapped up and removed. And in tandem with the archaeological removal, a team of conservators and archivists were working to number, annotate, and safely store each individual piece. And eventually we came down to the walls of the studio, and as you can see, that gradually the studio is becoming more and more empty. And here you have the empty studio. And when the studio was empty, we removed all the ceiling boards, the wooden ceiling boards, and also all the walls and the floorboards, and transported them to Dublin. On arrival in Dublin, our first task was to open all these boxes of material and then create a database with an entry on every single item found in the studio. And this took us almost 2 years to complete, with 4 people working on it full time. Every single thing found in the studio was photographed. It was described, its condition was described, it was measured, and any links that could be made with Francis Bacon's paintings or how he might have looked at the item were described. So every fingerprint from Bacon, every paint colour was described in detail, and this has been invaluable for us. So the completed database, which is accessible to the public, it offers a comprehensive record of the type of materials and techniques that Bacon was employing from 1961 onwards, and also an inventory of visual sources. And just to give you a sense of the types of materials, there's 570 books and catalogues, 1,500 photographs, 100 destroyed canvases, 1,300 pages torn from books, 2,000 samples of the artist's materials, and 70 drawings. And also there are various other things like correspondence between the artist and other individuals, magazines, newspapers, and furniture. And as we went along, obviously, this is just a very simple example of a passport strip of Francis Bacon, of which many were found in the studio, and how it links with his art. Similarly, on the left, we have a photograph that we found. You can see on the left-hand side his fingerprints in paint. So he's been looking at it as he painted this self-portrait. And again, the close links between the two can be seen. Also in this work, again, this was a discovery that we made. The two images on the screens on the left relate directly to these pages that we found in the studio. One is of Raymond Poincaré, the other is Austen Chamberlain. And again, this Bacon's interests were very wide-ranging. He was interested in history, politics, wildlife, medical imagery, X-ray techniques. He had a huge range of interests. And all these books and magazines have provided invaluable information for us as art historians. And they've provided great revelations in terms of the genesis of particular paintings. Again, we can see on the left-hand side is a photograph from a book called Positioning in Radiography, which was a medical textbook on X-ray techniques. And Bacon has directly copied the image on the left and included it in the painting on the right-hand side. Similarly, he manipulated many of the photographs found in the studio. This is a photograph of Lucien Freud on the left. And just to show you here, Bacon has deliberately creased the photo here. And if you see this paper clips here holding the crease in place, and then you can see that this has been copied in this area. And the chair also is something that is in his studio. So these are just a sample of many of the links that we were able to make going through the contents. And this really is just a small selection. There are many, many more. Also, Bacon said that he never produced drawings, that he painted directly onto the canvas, but we discovered a large number of drawings in the studio, so clearly that was something that he kept concealed. And this is probably one of the earliest drawings by Francis Bacon, which shows strong influence of Picasso. This is a photograph. He very much liked the photography of an American photographer called Peter Beard, and a large collection of photographs by Peter Beard were found in the studio, including this one of a zebra carcass. Now, aside from the art historian, the art historical part, where we made several links, as I said, with finished paintings, and we've made a huge number of discoveries. Furthermore, the studio contents have provided new information on Bacon's artistic practice. And Bacon once said that the artist's studio isn't the alchemist's study where he searches for the philosopher's stone. It would perhaps be more like a chemist's laboratory. So the Rhys Muse studio, aside from its role as a repository of visual sources, it was also primarily a place of manufacture. And all over the studio were found bowls, jars of pigment, paintbrushes, all the things that would be expected. And as I said, some 2,000 samples of Bacon's painting materials were eventually uncovered. And these include things like the jar of pigment there on the left-hand side from Cornelison's, which is an important supplier in London. On the right-hand side, we have a bowl with used paint tubes. Also, various packages were found in the studio too. And he didn't actually use a conventional palette at all. He used very, very good china, Spode and various other good English china to actually mix his colours. And again, we can see that the sort of recurring colours occurring here, the bright pinks. Also, saucepans were also used, and various knives and forks and various just household utensils. Also, in terms of the walls of the studio, as I said, these again give a good indication of the types of pigments that he was using. Now, when these were removed from Rhys Muse, we took them out of the floorboards and they were transported like a fresco and then transplanted into their new location in Dublin. And again, these again are invaluable. Also, I should point out that Bacon actually had no formal training as an artist. He didn't attend an art college. He was very happy that he didn't attend an art college because he said he could learn from other artists. So he was mainly self-educated, and he was also very experimental in terms of his procedures early on in his life. Also, he seems to have been very consistent because from 1944, he worked almost exclusively on stretched canvas, but during 1947, 1948, he began to paint on the unprimed side of a canvas, and that is something that he discovered by accident. He had been gambling in Monte Carlo, he ran out of money, and he decided to paint on the back of a canvas, and he liked the fact that it gripped the paint. So, of course, I mean, there were advantages and drawbacks to this process of self-education. For example, painting 1946, which is in MoMA in New York, is in a very fragile condition and is unfit to travel because of Bacon's experimentation. And here you see that he actually, he painted directly onto the wall, but he also wrote notes to himself, ideas for paintings. And you can see there that he's referring to a box, and the rectilinear cages that are such a feature of Bacon's paintings occur in these notes and also in handwritten notes that he made as well. And again, you have, this is an area that's to the left-hand side of the door, and again, the colours seem to be quite consistent. And Bacon rather mockingly referred to the walls of his studio as his only abstract paintings. He hated abstract art, and particularly the work of Jackson Pollock, and these he jokingly referred to, as I said, his only abstract paintings. And the daubs of paint, again, show the imprint of various textures. Here we have some of the fabrics that were found in the studio. On the left-hand side, you have corduroy trousers, which he would cut up. Most of them came from a shop called Marks and Spencer's, an English shop, and they were cut up, and he would obviously put wet paint onto the door or the wall, and then press the corduroy against it, and then press it onto his paintings. So, for example, in the cheekbones of the face of one of his subjects, the imprint of corduroy can be seen. He also used cashmere sweaters, which we see on the right-hand side. I'm not sure what the function of the hammer was, but it was stuck to the cashmere sweater. And again, he would use the weave from the cashmere sweater to actually print. Similarly with socks, ribbed socks, and various other items of clothing. Orange was, the artist said that orange was his favourite colour, and certainly over 30 jars of cadmium orange were found in the studio. And again, we can see that he was happy to mix paint in anything he could find. We just have a bucket that was in the studio that he was using to mix this type of paint. Also, the dominant Winsor and Newton pigments were chrome yellow, which we see here on the left-hand side. Also, he used Winsor orange and Winsor yellow. And on occasion, Bacon seems to have added pigments to the oil paint to increase the intensity of its colour. And most of the oil paint that was found in the studio was manufactured by Winsor and Newton, which obviously would have allowed him to recreate tones and colours that he had used in previous works with relative ease. Also, again, with the jars of pigment, the most common colours, as I said, are yellow, orange, black, and white, but also tubes of permanent rose and alizarin crimson were also found in considerable quantities. Also, we see spray paint on the right-hand side, and Bacon started using spray paint more extensively in the 1980s, and that atomized effect that he uses to create the flesh tones of his figures is achieved by using spray paint. He seems to have been, despite his experimental tendencies early on, he seems to have been quite conservative in terms of the brands and the types of pigments that he used. Also, the range of pigments wasn't actually that great, because Bacon's palette, and that's a feature certainly from the 1950s onwards, his palette was defined by relatively few colours: orange, red, yellow, black, blue and green. But I suppose it's really their daring use in very striking contrasts or dramatic combinations that delivered the impact. Also, tubes of universal stainer were found in colours like yellow, yellow oxide, black and blue. And universal stainers are, as I'm sure you all know, they're highly concentrated pigment dispersions which can be used to obtain the desired shades from most solvent and water-based paint. Also, there were several empty bottles of carbon tetrachloride which were found in the studio. This is a quick-drying and toxic solvent which Bacon may have used for thinning his paint or possibly removing paint stains from the canvas. Also, Bacon said in an interview with David Sylvester that he said, now I nearly always use acrylic for backgrounds, but actually we found very little acrylic paint in the studio. We did find many tins of household emulsion paint, so Carson's vinyl matte, also Dulux as well. And obviously these would have offered great advantages because these wouldn't need to be mixed in advance to be applied. And also we can see on the left-hand side that we have a household paintbrush on the left-hand side, and again many of these were found in the studio. Also, the paintbrushes could often be just put into these sort of tins, and several of these tins of butter beans or baked beans were found in the studio. The one on the left has a sock on top of it which is covered in dust, which again would have been employed in some way in his application of paint. Also, just to mention about the emulsion, these would be applied with the paint rollers which you saw for the background of paintings which you saw. And obviously that was advantageous because it could be applied very rapidly with the aid of a paint roller. And there's over 100 of those roller sponges found in the studio, most of them soaked or caked in paint. Also, in a number of works, Bacon squeezed paint directly from the tube onto the canvas, and he also used the plastic lids from paint tubes to actually create sometimes the indent of a circular white area or a mark on the canvas. And you can see here, actually, sorry, the charts, many of these charts for paint supplies were also found in the studio as well. And here you have on the left-hand side, you have those tops of paint tubes, which, as I said, were often used to be applied directly onto the canvas. Also, Bacon added things like sand to his wet paint as well. And as I said, the dust, and he said himself that another thing about the chaos of the studio was that he could use the dust that accumulated, and he rubbed his fingers into it. Also, a box of Rembrandt pastels were found on a low table. Sometimes he used pastel for the background of a number of works, and he said that it held particularly well to the unprimed canvas and also produced quite an intense colour on its surface. I mentioned as well his use of spray paint. The other thing that he seems to have used from the 1970s onwards were sheets of letraset, which are transfer letters, which we can see here, just here in this row. This is just a large one with numbers, but many sheets with letters were actually found. And these jumbled letters were often applied in a random fashion onto his canvases and without any sense or meaning. And again, it may have been his ongoing admiration of Picasso that might have prompted him to incorporate lettering into his work. Given the volume of artist materials and also the quantities of dust found in the studio, because after the studio was empty, the dust was swept up and put into a bag, and there was quite an amount of it. It's remarkable, I suppose, that Bacon, who was a chronic asthmatic, was able to work in such an unhealthy atmosphere for so long. He obviously protected his skin, because a lot of rubber gloves were found, marigold rubber gloves were found in the studio, covered in paint, and possibly he may have worn the gloves to enable him to manipulate the paint more freely than with his fingers. Just to conclude, despite Bacon's blunt assertion that he actually knew nothing about technique, certainly he developed over the years a very profound understanding of his materials and their inherent characteristics. And technique is taken considerably further than being a mere vehicle for representation. And Bacon often spoke about the complete interlocking of image and paint, so that every movement of the brush on the canvas alters the shape and implications of the image. And certainly that is something that was very evident. Also, in terms of the destroyed canvases found in the studio, there were over 100, and again, these are fascinating because they span from the 1940s onwards. Some of them were paintings that were taken to quite a realised scale and then slashed with a knife, a Stanley knife, in a fairly violent way. Bacon actually asked some other people to destroy the canvases. John Edwards would be asked to destroy other ones. So there are several of these portraits. They were small head portraits that he obviously disliked and had the canvas removed. Now, the canvas was taken away out of the studio, and only in one case did we actually find the two fragments that fitted into a painting, and that's a painting that dates from 1946, which would suggest that Bacon brought it with him to his Rhys Muse studio. So just to conclude, this is the final painting that Bacon was working on at the time of his death, and it would appear to be a self-portrait, so it was found on his easel at the time of his death. His sister told us that she remembered him working on it in November 1991, and then he died in April 1992. But it shows that he was still willing to attempt to paint on a large scale. And in terms of the reconstruction, the studio is open to the public in Dublin. It is extremely popular. So you have an audiovisual area where there's an interview with Bacon in his studio. Then the studio is preserved in like a glass cage, that you can step into and look at in detail. Also, there are two viewing points which give you this view from one end of the studio looking in. So this is exactly how it looks reconstructed in Dublin. And also, this is one of our famous visitors, Pierce Brosnan, using the audio or the terminals, which give you full information on everything found in the studio. And again, people are intrigued with finding out more about what Bacon had in his studio. And this is just an exterior of the gallery showing an exhibition that we had called A Terrible Beauty. So just to conclude, despite all the measuring and documentation that's gone into the project, I think in the end, in terms of the studio, it's something intangible and something almost magical that has been achieved with the reconstruction of the studio. And that is the spirit of the artist in the space. John Edwards, before his death, he visited the studio and he walked into it before the contents had been put in, and he said it was absolutely identical to, he felt as if he was in London. So we were very, very pleased with that. Also, I suppose that Bacon referred to the studio as being rather like his mind. So I suppose the studio has myriad connections to the virtual spaces of experience and also imagination. And the studio contents now have a dual purpose. They were cues, obviously, to the production of the works of art for Bacon, and now they are clues to us, to the process of the creation of works of art. And the daubs and splashes of paint also allow us to reimagine the act of Bacon painting in the studio, whereas the books, the photographs, the drawings and fragments of illustrations illuminate Bacon's mental processes for the visitor. And the disorder of the studio was certainly a source of aesthetic inspiration for Francis Bacon, and it continues to exert a fascination for visitors to the space. Thank you.